All right, the third house. So the third house is a kama house. That means it's a house of desire. So it shows a person's desires and their ability to, through self-effort, achieve those desires. So it's also what's called an upachaya or growing house. And upachaya or growing houses, they actually welcome malefics. There's certain circumstances where malefics will sort of trump that, and fallen planets in particular in the third house will still very much manifest negatively. But Saturn, Mars, the Sun, Rahu, and Ketu, the inherent malefics, they do well in upachayas as a general rule. Now, if the upachaya is in a house of fall or it's in a house of exaltation, then that makes a very, very big difference in the way you analyze them. But just on the basis of just being the third house, all things being equal, then malefics do well in these houses. So also these upachaya or growing houses, things get better over time. So the planets that are positive in them, whether they're benefic or malefic, the houses that that planet rules, the planet that's in the third house, they will improve over time, and kind of the basic characteristics, such as, say, Saturn's in the third house. This person would become increasingly disciplined over the course of their life and have more and more maturity, right? All things being equal. So the upachaya houses, real quick, are the 3rd, 6th, 10th, and 11th houses. And they get increasingly more powerful. So the third house is the weakest of the upachaya houses. So the third house rules communications, telecommunications, short journeys, logistics of all kinds, but especially local logistics, where we are talking about, like, say, a person who helps organize where trucks go, or an air traffic controller who controls a certain amount of space in the place where they live. That would be under the third house. There would have to be a connection between the third house and either the 9th or 12th houses for it to represent international logistics. So younger brothers or sisters are shown in the third house. Classically, it's brothers, but in the West, it's sisters as well. Is very important, sometimes more important. Bravery, adventures, personal degree of effort, life, energy, enthusiasm, initiative, motivation, desires, the ability to achieve those desires. A person's not the way they speak, but their actual voice. Okay, so fine arts of music, dance, drama, acting, dancing, singing, directors, producers, and organizers. So it's also hearing, how well a person can hear physically. Just as the first house rules the body, the third house rules the quality of hearing and all aspects of communications. So mental stability, firmness of personality, letters, like the way the person would write. You could probably say emails nowadays, right? Or text even. Emoji text. Oh no, communication's really degraded. Letters, communication, writing, servants, travel in the form of short journeys. While it especially means brothers, it tends to indicate them a bit more. It does also mean just siblings in general, which, again, in the West, someone might have a younger brother and a younger sister, and it's the younger sister who's super critical to their life, and the younger brother isn't, for whatever reason, probably due to a mixed condition of lordship. But so it's you always have to, when you're looking at the classical rules of Vedic astrology, assuming that you live in the West, or even really the modern urban parts of India are much like the West in many ways. So if you're looking at someone who's living in modernity, almost would be a better way to put it, right? Who lives in an urban center rather than rurally, and is sort of connected to the global consciousness to some degree, even though, of course, they're going to have variations based on region and culture. So yeah, the context of the chart you're looking at matters quite a bit. A German's chart is going to play out differently than a Scotsman's chart. A Scotsman's chart is going to play out very different than a Chinese person's chart, because of course you have to go through that lens. So speaking as a Westerner, talking about Western culture, you have to pour Vedic astrology through that lens of the modern world. Technology is just huge. Like, obviously, they didn't mean email when the rishis came up with the third house back then. So you have to modernize, right, both culturally and technologically, and that's part of where the art of Vedic astrology really comes in more so than the rules. And you kind of have to expand, logically extrapolate what those rules mean in modernity. And I think it's important to be flexible in that way while still honoring the tradition and culture of Vedic India. If you're doing modern interpretations, you simply cannot ignore that it hits different in the 2020s than it did in 3000 BC India. And it's absurd to say otherwise. And so you have to look at that. I also think that, astrology, the Vedic astrology, part of the beauty of it is how untouched and pure it's been. But I also think that we need to also consider that both with Vedic and Western astrology, that there's going to need to be significant updates with the end of the Kali Yuga. The difference is that with Western astrology, it's been changing and evolving over time. It's probably just needs some cleanup because it's so all over the place at this point. Some of it's amazing. Some of the work people are doing, some people are just, turn out nonsense. The Vedic astrology is the opposite. People have, out of a respect for the tradition and certainly the accuracy of it, they don't want to make changes. But the fact of the matter is that times have changed. And we need to look at our chart interpretations through the lens of both our understanding of the world based on some modern person living wherever you might live, and also where a client is located, or the person who we're doing the reading for, where they live and what their culture is. I mean, it becomes difficult, of course, to read someone's chart if they're from a very different culture from yours that you have no familiarity of. But some of these archetypal things play out. They just play out different culturally. So I'm giving you some tips about how the third house means something very different in the 2020s if you live in an urban, technologically advanced civilization than it did 3000 BC India. Okay, enough about that aside. So, so the third lord is considered a very, very weak malefic. So, say you're a Taurus ascendant, the moon as third lord is a very weak malefic, functional malefic, because it rules the third house. But it's not that bad. It's so close to neutral. It's one of the most wishy-washy houses, along with like the second and the 11th, that it just kind of goes along with whatever the other lordship is. Where it's a little more tricky is when it's the sun or moon and you only rule one house. So that happens with a Taurus ascendant has a third house, third lord moon, and then a Gemini ascendant has a third lord sun. And so the sun's already malefic, so it really kind of almost only matters for a Taurus ascendant, and even then it's just not that big of an impact, because if you rule the third house and then the fourth house, say like with a Scorpio ascendant, Saturn would rule the third house of Capricorn and the fourth house of Aquarius. Well, now Saturn is actually a functional benefic because it rules an angular house, even though it's the weakest of the angular houses other than the first house. The first house, being a Kendra and Kona combined, is more powerful than the first, fourth, it's more powerful than the fourth, seventh, or 10th in a certain sense, but it's also the weakest for the flavor of the Kendra. But the fourth house is just one step up from that. So even though it's kind of a weak benefic force, it still overpowers the third house. That's how weak of a malefic impact it has. I just really want to emphasize that. So so the third house also shows communication overall, not just limited to verbal communication like the second house. It shows one's desire and ability to communicate effectively, and this is incredibly important, especially for artists and those who work in communications and telecommunications related fields in modernity, but also for those who work in logistics, such as aircraft traffic controllers, truck or emergency vehicle dispatch, or those who work in the transitioning of goods over short distances. So people who like move products to stores locally. Local truck drivers might have a very prominent third house if you just do local deliveries. If paired with the 9th or 12th lord, it can show, or like perhaps a bus driver in a city. If paired with 9th or 12th lord, it can show international trade logistics. So it does have to show 9th and 12th lord interaction in order to get that international logistics, like someone who deals with the Baltic Dry Index and even probably knows what that is. You're either in finance or you're in international logistics to know what the Baltic Dry Index is. So, and for me, it's finance, obviously. It can also show adventures and misadventures and therefore opportunities of all kinds, some of which I'm updating my notes, some of which one might do best to avoid. So, for example, I've seen before a fallen 8th lord in the 3rd house, and that could lead to one becoming a drug addict and be involved in all sorts of horrifying misadventures because they're involved with hard drugs and that illegal scene and the danger in that, the exploitation, all that horrible, horrible stuff. So conversely, if someone had an exalted planet in the 3rd house or an exalted 3rd lord, right? So like imagine that you have that earlier example of a Gemini ascendant, but you have 3rd lord sun in the house of Leo, in the 3rd house of Leo. Well, that person might be just like someone who's like a tour guide or does like teaches people hang gliding or something, like they really have adventures. They're a surfing instructor, they're a scuba instructor, something like that. They have really powerful 3rd house. They might do something that's very adventurous that most people wouldn't even consider. Maybe being a boat captain on a crabbing boat in Alaska, very dangerous, but if you have an exalted 3rd lord, you might be able to make just an insane amount of money and do something, that is very adventurous and also involves some sort of travel. Or 3rd house doesn't rule vehicles, but it does kind of rule short journeys. And so things like hang gliding or skydiving or scuba diving or things like this can all be indicated by the 3rd house. So that's something to consider. So yeah, that is the 3rd house. It rules siblings, and so mixed indicators on 3rd house, probably mixed interactions with siblings. Really positive 3rd house might be a great artist, great communicator, and involved with amazing adventures and having a strong and powerful connection with siblings. That is the 3rd house. Thank you. And just to continue, forgot to say this. If you're interested, I will be teaching astrology classes probably sometime in late October, early November of 2023. And then I am doing astrology readings through elite for natal charts, which is the first 40 years of life, and Navamsa, the last 40 years of life. And I am doing that at least through the end of October 2023. At some point, I'll be switching into working for a company. And at that point, I'll be doing far fewer and maybe no readings whatsoever, except for returning clients. So if you're interested, now's the time to book. Thank you and have a great day. Bye.